So there's hardly a week goes by where you don't see a story about some punter who's been refused some ginormous payout, and how unfair is that, and let's fight the corner of this particular punter, and so on. After all, it's great publicity, but of course just about every media outlet, especially in this age of diminishing attention, is going for your eyeballs, because ultimately the more people that view the article or any variant thereof about this incredibly unjust story are going to get paid for it, directly or indirectly. And therefore you just see these stories getting pumped out all of the time. Nobody actually tells you what you should be doing, which is where my focus generally is, because ultimately, I've been betting for a long period of time, enormous amounts of money, and I never have these problems mysteriously. I have done some videos on this, so I'm not going to discuss that in this particular video. But what I am going to discuss in this video is why this payout was refused, because it teaches you a lot about exactly what you should and shouldn't be doing. Because in order to bet profitably in the long term, you want to be able to understand what the odds actually mean. And generally that means talking about probabilities. We don't like doing that. And that's why bookmakers and everybody doesn't want you to understand that, because fundamentally speaking, they just want you to accept whatever odds you're given. But on this particular occasion, there's a couple of twists in the tale, because fundamentally speaking, the bookmaker was correct in not paying out on this particular occasion. And that's down to how the bet was placed and the sort of bet that was placed on this particular occasion. So I think it's important, if you're going to look at this story properly, to understand specifically why the bookmaker didn't pay out and why they were correct in not doing so. I've been successfully betting and trading for over 2 decades. If you want more videos like this and you want me to describe more of what I do, then give us a like. If you want to talk to like-minded people, visit the BetAngel forum, where you can do exactly that, but also visit our website where you can download a free trial of BetAngel. So if you're going to bet seriously, it's really important that you understand some simple and basic things. Most people don't bother going there, and that's where bookmakers have a big advantage over your average punter in the market, because the average punter just wants to win. They think that this player is going to do well, or this team is going to win, and it's like, I'll stick a tenner on that horse because I think he's got a good chance. I'm going to lump 100 quid on England because they're going to beat Andorra. But over the long term, the only way that you could possibly win is if you stack those odds in your favour. And when we talk about stacking odds in your favour, what we're talking about is, if you, say, place a bet on something at evens with a bookmaker, what that is actually doing is you're saying that something has a 50% chance of winning. I'm not going to go into great depth on this video about that, because I have covered it in other videos. But basically, if you bet on evens, you're saying something's got a 50% chance. It's represented as decimal odds on a betting exchange is 2.00. It's a 50% chance of something occurring. So the only way you'll win money in the long term is to actually bet, or for that bet to win at a higher rate than 50%. And of course, on a betting exchange, you can get value in both directions. You can back or lay. But with a bookmaker, you can only basically back when that situation is going to occur much more frequently. In other words, they've got their odds wrong. So understanding odds is one of the first steps that you need to do if you're going to bet seriously longer term. But it's beyond the scope of this video to go into that. I would need to do a separate video entirely on that. And in fact, I have done some. So we're not going to cover that in great depth, but it's important to have this in here as a starting point for what we're going to discuss. So if you're placing a bet on a single individual outcome, it's quite simple. You place a bet, you get some odds, and then you win or lose. And if you can basically bet to value, you will make money over the longer term. However, when you bet on multiple events, you have to start understanding the probability of these things happening a little bit better. If we flip a coin, there's a 1 in 2 chance it will be a heads. If we flip it twice and say, what's the chance of 2 heads? We multiply those two together. We say it's 2 by 2. It's a 1 in 4 chance. If we flip it again, it's a 1 in 8, 1 in 16, 1 in 32, 64, 128, 512, 1024, 2048, 4096, 16,384, and so on. I could go on for an endless number of iterations, but basically you can see that the odds on getting a heads continuously expands dramatically over a period of time. Now, when I started on my betting career, I became sort of quite deeply interested in all of these sort of things, because I knew that that was the key for me understanding when I could potentially see value in a bet. And, you come across all sorts of fascinating stuff, and I have done a video on this, but if you look at the birthday problem, you sort of think, I've just given you an example of how that curve expands dramatically when you start tossing more than one coin. But when we look at the birthday problem, how many people do you need in a room before it becomes more likely than not that 2 or more people share the same birthday? You've got 365 days in the year. How many people do you need in a room before 2 or more of them are more likely to have the same birthday? And I remember reading up on the birthday problem and being completely stunned by the result, because the answer is 23. You only need 23 or more people in the room before it becomes more likely that 2 or more people share the same birthday. And it seems completely counterintuitive. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Surely you'd need 366 people in the room for other people to start duplicating birthdays. But it doesn't work like that, and that is because of the way probability works. You either add it, you multiply it, you use converse probability. There are many different ways of figuring out the outcome of something actually happening. And that goes right to the core of the problem on why this particular payout wasn't given. But to understand why, let's have a look at a football match and understand what we could or couldn't bet on, and how that affects those particular probabilities. So we're looking at a spreadsheet here. Don't panic, because I'm going to explain it in the simplest terms that I can think of. But basically what you're looking at here are the result of thousands of football matches. And to explain what this is, if we say a football match ends 2-1, how many times does a match end 2-1 on this particular data set? Just over 9%. How many 4-0 wins are there? About 2%. Generally, these numbers are a bit lower than most people would suspect, but they all add up to 100%. So all of these results that we have listed here add up to 100%. And all we're looking at is the individual chance of something, of a particular scoreline occurring. Now what I've done is I've split these out into the draw. So you can see I've taken out the 0-0, the 1-all, the 2-all, the 3-all, and the 4-all. There were no other draws that occurred at higher scores within this particular sample set. So we know by adding all of these up that the chance of a draw here is about 27%. And if we convert that back into decimal odds, that's about 3.7. So it's basically saying you'd get odds of 3.7 if you decided to back the draw. If we wanted to back 0-0, that occurred 8.67% of the time, which actually adds up or converts to odds of about 11.5, which is about right. You would expect a draw to occur about 8% of the time. So if we multiply these two together, you can see the chance of a draw and a 0-0 would equate to 2.35%, or about odds of 40-1. But that's a total nonsense. You would not multiply these two together because they are related. And by related, we mean that if you back the draw, then of course that includes an element of 0-0. And if you back 0-0, you're actually backing a draw. So you can't put these two together in a double. You can't put them into an accumulator because they are both completely related. They're not independent, and therefore you would not multiply these numbers together to get those much larger odds. It's just not possible. You would not do it. That is not how probability works, and you would not accept a bet on this particular basis. So yeah, because they're joined together, because they're related, you can't multiply these probabilities to come up with much bigger odds. So I hope that I've explained that well enough. Basically, if you bet on a draw, you're sort of betting on 0-0. And if you bet on 0-0, you're sort of betting on a draw. They are related events. You can't multiply them together because they both sort of mesh together at some point or another at a fundamental level. When we were doing the coin toss, we're basically doing independent events. We're saying, here's one coin toss, and then here's another. And therefore you multiply those together to get the odds, but you can't do that with related events. It's just not possible. And, you know, this is why it's so important, if you're a professional gambler or trader or anything, that you understand at some base level probabilities, because their probabilities can be a little bit confusing at times. But also, if you think you found some amazing flaw or something somewhere, you could fall into this trap as well, because you think that you're onto something and it turns out you've just messed up or not read the rules, or you don't understand fundamentally the principles behind exactly what you're doing. So it's really important that you get a handle on this sort of thing, which is why I thought I'd do this video to explain. And the reason that this is important is because where Liam fell down on this particular bet is he created a treble. He went into corals, basically wrote down a treble and handed it in, but that treble contained events that were all related. He bet on Lionel Messi to be player of the tournament, which is fair enough. He bet on this treble for Argentina to win the World Cup, which is also fair enough. Although you could argue that if Argentina won the World Cup, that is, that would improve the chances of Lionel Messi actually picking up player of the tournament. So that's semi-related because, of course, Argentina could win the tournament without him being player of the tournament. So there's a sort of weak relationship there, but it's, you could easily argue that the two are independent of each other, though not completely. Hopefully you understand where I'm coming from here. But the third bet that he placed on this treble definitely is related because he also put on there an Argentina France final. So Argentina-France final and Argentina to win the World Cup are very, very strongly related, and therefore that is definitely cannot be multiplied together to produce a much, much bigger payoff. Coral are perfectly within their right to say that this was an invalid bet because you've got at least two of them are definitely related, and therefore you couldn't make it a treble. You couldn't multiply those probabilities together to get that £15,000 payoff. It's just not, it's invalid. It's completely invalid from any way that you look at it. And if you look at this from this perspective, Coral have actually made a half-decent settlement because they've taken the bigger odds and then multiplied it with another one of the bets and given a fair payoff. I think they've settled this fairly well because they could just go and say, no, these are all singles, because it is definitely not a treble that you've been able to place with us here. And also, if you think about it, if they were to allow these sort of bets to go through, then people could just go around all the stores and try and fit these bets in to basically stick one over on Coral. And I can give you first-hand experience of this. It's because that's what I did in the early 90s. All those years ago, I was looking for little flaws and I came across this way back then. So, if you're going to bet or trade professionally, you need to understand your probabilities, you need to understand how these events are related and so on, because you may be looking at something through a completely incorrect lens and that could cost you a lot of money. Fortunately, on this occasion, it didn't cost Liam any money because they have offered to settle, and I think it's a fair settlement. But, you do ask yourself this question of how many other betting slips are going through and not being noticed. And they're just sort of taking the money and obviously not paying out on them because they were losers. And, I don't know how the extent of that in any particular way. But certainly if you try and do this bet online, the thing that you will notice is you will not be able to place this bet, because the logic is built in to the betting systems. And when you try and place a bet like that, it will get declined. And maybe it should have been declined at the store. But of course, it's very difficult to enforce all of those things. And I found that out many years ago because I was able to come up with quite interesting bets that people couldn't really understand. And it was only when they went to pay out the bets did they really try and get a handle on exactly what I was doing. But even then, they can just turn away your business anyway. And also, bookmakers have sort of floor limits in terms of the amount that they're willing to pay out on certain types of bets and so on. And, as I've said in other videos as well, if you want to watch those, these guys are in business. They're an entertainment business. And if there's a possibility that they could bankrupt themselves through something, that's encapsulated within terms and conditions. So yeah, Liam, I would take the settlement because I think it doesn't matter how much you're going to argue about this particular bet. There's no way that this is a treble, and there is no way that you should get paid the £15,000. It just doesn't make any sense. There's no argument that you can place that would change my mind on that. And I suspect that would be the same even if you took it to a higher level. So it's incorrect of all of the fuss and publicity around this to not point that out. I think people either don't know or they're just choosing to ignore that for a little bit of publicity. But that is why I did this video ultimately, because I think it's important that you understand that, and you understand that you need to have a broader appreciation of exactly what you're doing if you're going to be successful at this game.